The packed auditorium at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service buzzed with the electric energy that accompanied high-profile political debates on America's most prestigious campuses. The event, billed as Democratic Socialism in the 21st Century. Lessons from Latin America, had drawn hundreds of students, professors, and progressive activists eager to hear Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez defend her vision of democratic socialism against what organizers had described as conservative fear-mongering about successful socialist policies. AOC commanded the main podium with her signature confidence, her perfectly styled hair and designer glasses projecting the image of a young political revolutionary who had captured the imagination of millions of progressive Americans. The audience of college students and faculty responded to her opening remarks with enthusiastic applause, their energy reflecting both genuine excitement about socialist alternatives to capitalism and generational frustration with traditional American economic systems. "We must reject the false narrative that socialism inevitably leads to authoritarianism," AOC declared, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had mastered the art of inspiring progressive crowds. Countries like Venezuela have faced challenges primarily because of U.S. sanctions and interference, not because of their commitment to social justice and economic equality. The statement drew roaring approval from the Georgetown audience, particularly from students who had been taught that American foreign policy was primarily responsible for Latin American instability. AOC's communications team, monitoring social media engagement in real time, watched approvingly as her Venezuela defense generated immediate positive response across progressive platforms. But seated quietly in the back row, nearly invisible among the young progressive activists, Senator John Neely Kennedy of Louisiana was taking methodical notes. The soft-spoken Republican had been invited to provide alternative perspective on democratic socialism, though most attendees expected him to offer predictable conservative talking points rather than serious challenges to AOC's carefully crafted narrative about socialist success stories. Kennedy's wire-rimmed glasses reflected the auditorium lighting as he reviewed a thick folder of State Department reports, United Nations data, and human rights organization documentation he'd compiled about Venezuela's actual conditions. His research had revealed a stark disconnect between AOC's rhetoric about Venezuelan socialism and the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding under the Maduro regime. The Venezuelan people have shown incredible courage in building a more equitable society despite constant pressure from American corporations and their government allies, AOC continued, consulting her prepared remarks with practiced ease. Their commitment to healthcare, education, and social programs represents exactly the kind of democratic socialist policies we need to implement here in America. The presentation was polished, passionate, and politically calculated to appeal to young Americans frustrated with income inequality and corporate power. AOC's combination of anti-imperialist rhetoric and socialist policy advocacy was exactly the kind of message that resonated with college audiences skeptical of American capitalism. Kennedy slowly raised his hand from the back of the auditorium, the gesture so unexpected that it immediately drew attention from both AOC and the audience. The Louisiana senator's reputation for devastating political performances had made him a figure that even confident progressive politicians approached with considerable caution. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Kennedy said, his Louisiana drawl cutting through the charged academic atmosphere, "I appreciate your passion for social justice. But I wonder if you might help me understand some current conditions in Venezuela that seem to contradict your characterization of their socialist success." AOC's confident smile tightened almost imperceptibly as she recognized that her carefully choreographed presentation was about to become something more unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The room fell silent as students sensed the possibility of genuine political conflict rather than the progressive echo chamber they'd expected. "Senator Kennedy," AOC replied, her voice maintaining professional courtesy while her eyes betrayed a flicker of concern, "I'd be happy to address any questions about the complex situation in Venezuela, though I hope we can avoid the typical right-wing propaganda that ignores American responsibility for the crisis." Kennedy adjusted his glasses with that familiar motion that made experienced politicians nervous. When he spoke again, his tone remained respectful but carried an unmistakable edge that suggested he had come prepared with more than conservative talking points. "Well, Representative, since you mentioned the complex situation, maybe we should look at some current data from international organizations that have been monitoring Venezuelan conditions. Kennedy reached into his folder and pulled out a familiar stack of documents, the gesture that anyone who had watched his previous political demolitions knew spelled serious trouble for his target. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Kennedy began, consulting his papers with theatrical precision. Over 7.7 million Venezuelans have fled their country since your democratic socialist government took power. That's nearly 25% of the entire population. For a successful socialist system, that seems like a lot of people voting with their feet. The statistic hit the auditorium like a political thunderbolt. AOC's media team exchanged alarmed glances while students throughout the audience immediately began fact-checking Kennedy's claim on their phones and laptops. Furthermore, Kennedy continued, his voice still calm but increasingly pointed, according to the World Food Program, 1 million Venezuelans are experiencing food insecurity, with 2.9 million facing severe food shortages. The average Venezuelan has lost 24 pounds due to malnutrition. Is widespread starvation part of the democratic socialist success story you're advocating for America? AOC tried to regain control of what had been her own event. Senator, those statistics don't account for the impact of illegal U.S. sanctions. You're right about sanctions, Kennedy interrupted gently, unfolding additional documents from his folder. Let's talk about the timeline. According to State Department records, the Venezuelan economic collapse and refugee crisis began in 2013, but the major U.S. sanctions weren't implemented until 2017. That's 4 years of socialist economic disaster before sanctions could be blamed. The audience was riveted, watching AOC's carefully constructed narrative about Venezuelan socialism crumble under Kennedy's systematic presentation of uncomfortable international data. Her role as a democratic socialist advocate was being exposed as based on propaganda rather than actual conditions. Kennedy consulted his notes again, his glasses reflecting the auditorium lights. And Representative, you mentioned Venezuela's commitment to healthcare. According to Doctors Without Borders, 40% of Venezuelan hospitals lack basic supplies, infant mortality has increased 30%, and preventable diseases like measles and diphtheria have returned. Is collapsed healthcare another feature of the socialist model you want to bring to America? The systematic destruction of AOC's Venezuelan socialism defense was unfolding in real time before an audience of the very students and professors she'd been trying to inspire. Kennedy's preparation was revealing that every major social indicator in Venezuela had deteriorated catastrophically under socialist governance. But here's my favorite statistic, Kennedy said, his voice taking on that dangerous quality that preceded his most devastating attacks. You've talked about Venezuela's social programs and economic equality. According to Transparency International, Venezuela now ranks as the second most corrupt country in the Western Hemisphere. Their socialist leaders have stolen billions while their people starve. Is that the kind of equality you're advocating for American workers? AOC's face visibly paled as Kennedy exposed the massive corruption of the socialist government she'd been praising. The contrast between her rhetorical emphasis on social justice and the actual human suffering caused by Venezuelan socialism was devastating. Senator Kennedy, AOC said, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration, you're using selective statistics to create a misleading narrative about American imperialism's role in destabilizing progressive governments. Selective statistics? Kennedy's eyebrows rose with mock surprise. Representative, these are comprehensive reports from the United Nations, World Health Organization, and international human rights groups. Unless you think these organizations are part of some American conspiracy against socialism, these numbers represent the actual results of the policies you're advocating. The response was vintage Kennedy, respectful in tone but devastating in substance. He'd just accused AOC of dismissing objective international data as imperialist propaganda, a position that made her look either ignorant or delusional about socialist reality. Kennedy gathered his papers with deliberate ceremony, his point clearly made but his lesson about socialism far from complete. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, I appreciate your concern for American workers and social justice. But when 7.7 million people flee a country, when children are dying from preventable diseases, when people are eating garbage to survive, that's not democratic socialism success. That's humanitarian catastrophe caused by the exact policies you want to implement in America. The auditorium fell silent as Kennedy's assessment hung in the air like smoke from an ideological explosion. AOC stood frozen at the podium, her prepared talking points about socialist success rendered useless by Kennedy's systematic presentation of Venezuelan reality. The American people deserve leaders who learn from socialist failures, not politicians who ignore human suffering to advance ideological fantasies, Kennedy concluded, his Louisiana wisdom cutting through years of progressive propaganda about Venezuelan socialism. As Kennedy sat down, the audience buzzed with uncomfortable conversations as students absorbed the implications of what they just witnessed. AOC's socialist advocacy had been systematically destroyed by a quiet senator from Louisiana armed with nothing but international humanitarian data and devastating delivery. The viral clips were already breaking the internet before AOC recovered enough to continue her presentation. The aftermath of Kennedy's devastating Georgetown University demolition of AOC's Venezuela socialism defense spread across social media like digital wildfire. Within minutes of the campus confrontation ending, clips of Kennedy systematically exposing Venezuelan humanitarian catastrophe while AOC defended socialist policies were breaking every major platform. #Venezuela Reality and #Kennedy Destroys AOC dominated Twitter, while TikTok and YouTube exploded with reaction videos from Venezuelan refugees sharing their own stories of socialist horror that confirmed every statistic Kennedy had cited. In her Queens district office, AOC sat surrounded by a crisis management team that looked as shell-shocked as their boss. Her communications director, a progressive activist who had crafted AOC's democratic socialist messaging for years, frantically monitored engagement metrics while watching their carefully constructed narrative about successful socialism collapse in real time. "Congresswoman, this is catastrophic," her chief of staff said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Kennedy's UN statistics are being verified by every major outlet, and Venezuelan refugees are creating viral content backing up his numbers. Even our core demographic is sharing clips questioning your Venezuela defense. AOC stared at her phone, watching endless TikTok videos from Venezuelan immigrants in Miami, New York, and Los Angeles recounting the exact horrors Kennedy had documented with international data. Young Venezuelan Americans, many her own age, were creating content that systematically destroyed her narrative about Venezuelan socialist success while sharing personal stories of family members who had died from starvation and medical shortages. How did we not prepare for the refugee statistics? AOC asked quietly, more to herself than to her staff. 7.7 million people fled. How do you defend a system when a quarter of the population escaped? Her policy advisor, a former Democratic Socialist of America organizer who had helped develop AOC's Latin American foreign policy positions, shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, we focused on anti-imperialist messaging and assumed questions would center on U.S. sanctions rather than actual conditions inside Venezuela. We didn't anticipate this level of international documentation." Meanwhile, in Baton Rouge, Kennedy was experiencing a social media phenomenon unlike anything in his political career. His systematic exposure of Venezuelan socialism's failures had resonated far beyond conservative circles, reaching Latino communities, international human rights advocates, and young Americans who were horrified to learn the truth about the socialist policies AOC had been promoting. Kennedy's office was flooded with messages from Venezuelan refugees, human rights organizations, and international development experts thanking him for exposing the reality of socialist governance. A particularly viral video testimonial from Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado had already garnered 12 million views, praising Kennedy for telling the truth about our people's suffering while American politicians spread propaganda about our oppression. The social media response was unprecedented in its international scope. Venezuelan diaspora communities across the United States began sharing Kennedy's clips alongside their own family photos showing the devastating effects of socialist policies, children suffering from malnutrition, hospitals without electricity, empty grocery stores that AOC's rhetoric had ignored. A particularly devastating trend emerged called the Venezuela Truth Challenge, where Venezuelan immigrants posted before and after photos of their homeland, showing thriving communities from the 1990s contrasted with current images of abandoned buildings, empty hospitals, and refugee camps. The hashtag garnered over 100 million views as the Venezuelan diaspora used Kennedy's platform to educate Americans about socialist reality. International human rights organizations seized on Kennedy's performance to amplify their own documentation of Venezuelan atrocities. Human Rights Watch republished their comprehensive reports on political persecution, torture, and extrajudicial killings under Maduro's socialist government, noting that Senator Kennedy's Georgetown presentation provides crucial visibility for Venezuelan suffering that has been ignored by socialist sympathizers in American politics. Progressive college campuses, AOC's supposed stronghold, became particularly hostile territory following Kennedy's revelation of socialist failures. Students at Georgetown, Columbia, and NYU began organizing Venezuela Reality seminars featuring Venezuelan refugee speakers who systematically debunked the romantic socialist narratives their professors had been teaching. AOC attempted damage control with a hastily produced Instagram live session, but her response only deepened the crisis. Speaking from her well-appointed apartment and flanked by progressive books, she tried to reframe Kennedy's documented humanitarian disaster as imperialist propaganda designed to justify American intervention. Senator Kennedy is using cherry-picked statistics to advance the same interventionist agenda that has destabilized Latin America for decades, AOC declared, her voice carrying less conviction than usual. We cannot allow humanitarian concerns to be weaponized against progressive governments fighting for social justice. The response was immediately catastrophic. Venezuelan refugees flooded her comments section with photos of dead family members, empty pharmacies, and starving children, asking AOC to explain how their suffering represented cherry-picked statistics rather than lived reality under socialism. Kennedy, meanwhile, used his unexpected international moment to advance a broader message about ideology versus human suffering. In a follow-up interview with Tucker Carlson that garnered 18 million views across platforms, he addressed the moral implications of American politicians promoting policies that had caused humanitarian catastrophe. I don't care what you call your economic system, capitalism, socialism, or purple unicornism, Kennedy said, his Louisiana drawl filling Fox News studios. When 7.7 million people flee your country, when children are dying from preventable diseases, when people are eating garbage to survive, that system has failed. Period. The interview became the most shared foreign policy content of the year, resonating with viewers across party lines who appreciated Kennedy's focus on human outcomes rather than ideological labels. International media began featuring Kennedy's Venezuela critique in their own coverage of American socialist movements. BBC World Service, Deutsche Welle, and France 24 all broadcast segments analyzing how Kennedy's documentation had exposed the disconnect between American progressive rhetoric and Latin American socialist reality. Academic foreign policy programs started incorporating Kennedy's Venezuela data into their curricula, teaching students that effective international relations required understanding actual conditions rather than ideological assumptions about foreign governments. The transformation extended to AOC's own progressive allies, many of whom quietly distanced themselves from her Venezuela positions after Kennedy's exposure of the humanitarian disaster. Democratic Socialist of America chapters across the country saw membership drops as young Americans learned the truth about Venezuelan socialism from refugee testimonials Kennedy's performance had amplified. Corporate America also responded to the cultural shift Kennedy had catalyzed. Major companies with Latino employee bases began highlighting their Venezuelan refugee hiring programs, recognizing that Kennedy's moment had created widespread American awareness of the Venezuelan diaspora's struggles. CNN, despite their typical liberal bias, commissioned a documentary about Venezuelan refugees in the United States, specifically citing the public conversation Kennedy had sparked about the humanitarian crisis that American media had largely ignored while focusing on political rhetoric. As AOC's socialist credibility continued to collapse, Kennedy began receiving recognition from unexpected international sources. Venezuelan opposition leaders, exiled journalists, and human rights advocates acknowledged that his Georgetown performance had accomplished more for Venezuelan awareness than years of their own advocacy efforts. Senator Kennedy did something remarkable. He forced Americans to confront the reality of Venezuelan suffering that our own politicians have been ignoring, noted Venezuelan journalist Patricia Polio from exile in Miami. His numbers came from the UN, not from propaganda. Truth doesn't have a political party. Kennedy's approach had achieved something extraordinary in American foreign policy discourse. He had used AOC's own socialist advocacy to educate Americans about the human cost of the policies she promoted. His method, comprehensive international documentation, systematic presentation of humanitarian data, respectful but devastating precision, had become a new template for challenging ideological rhetoric with human reality. International development organizations began using Kennedy's Georgetown technique as training material, showing how factual preparation could effectively challenge political narratives that ignored humanitarian consequences. The quiet revolution in American understanding of socialism was led by a humble senator from Louisiana who understood that political ideologies must be judged by their human results rather than their theoretical promises, and that 7 million Venezuelan refugees represented a moral reality that transcended partisan politics and demanded honest acknowledgement from American political leaders regardless of their ideological preferences. The complete transformation of American socialist discourse reached its stunning conclusion 3 weeks after Kennedy's devastating Georgetown University exposure of Venezuelan humanitarian catastrophe disguised as democratic socialism success. What had begun as AOC's calculated attempt to promote socialist policies through romanticized narratives about Venezuelan governance had evolved into a fundamental realignment of how young Americans understood the human cost of socialist ideology, with the quiet Louisiana senator establishing new standards that prioritize documented human suffering over political theory. AOC's retreat from her role as democratic socialism's primary advocate was swift and comprehensive. Her signature policy proposals lost mainstream Democratic support as voters learned the truth about Venezuelan conditions from refugee testimonials Kennedy's performance had amplified. The young congresswoman who had built her political brand on socialist advocacy now found herself unable to credibly discuss alternative economic systems without facing immediate challenges about the 7.7 million Venezuelan refugees whose suffering contradicted her ideological narrative. The revelation about widespread starvation, medical collapse, and political persecution under Venezuelan socialism proved particularly devastating because it demonstrated the gap between AOC's theoretical policy advocacy and the actual human consequences of implementing her preferred economic system. Progressive organizations across the country were forced to confront how their romantic socialist narratives had ignored massive human suffering in favor of ideological purity. Democratic leadership privately acknowledged that AOC's Venezuela defense had become a toxic liability for progressive politics. Her strategy of dismissing humanitarian disasters as imperialist propaganda had provided Republicans with devastating ammunition against democratic socialist policies, undermining carefully constructed narratives about progressive compassion and social justice. The Democratic Socialist of America quietly removed AOC from high-profile international solidarity campaigns, announcing it as a focus on domestic policy priorities that fooled no one. The move served as public acknowledgement of her complete loss of credibility on international socialist issues following Kennedy's documentation of Venezuelan reality. Meanwhile, Kennedy's influence on American understanding of socialism continued to expand internationally. His systematic destruction of AOC's Venezuela narrative had demonstrated that socialist advocacy was vulnerable to humanitarian fact-checking, establishing new standards for political evaluation that prioritized human outcomes over ideological rhetoric. The international human rights community embraced Kennedy's results-focused approach to political system evaluation. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights invited him to address their annual conference, recognizing his unique contribution to exposing socialist humanitarian failures that had been ignored by American progressive politicians. Political systems must be judged by their human results, not their theoretical promises, Kennedy told the gathering of international human rights advocates. When millions of people flee a country, when children die from preventable diseases, when families search garbage for food, no political theory justifies that suffering. Global refugee advocacy organizations took notice of Kennedy's methodology. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees specifically praised Kennedy's Georgetown presentation for bringing crucial attention to Venezuelan displacement that political rhetoric had obscured in American discourse. Academic political science programs also embraced Kennedy's approach. Harvard's Kennedy School created a seminar called Ideology versus Humanitarian Reality, based on his AOC encounter, teaching students that effective policy analysis required examining actual human outcomes rather than theoretical political frameworks. The London School of Economics invited Kennedy to deliver their annual comparative government lecture, where he outlined comprehensive principles for evaluating political systems that emphasized measurable human welfare rather than ideological categorization. Democracy serves people by protecting their fundamental rights and meeting their basic needs, Kennedy told the international audience of scholars and policymakers. Any system that creates mass starvation, medical collapse, and refugee crises has failed its basic governmental obligations regardless of its theoretical appeal. AOC made one final attempt at ideological rehabilitation, scheduling a major socialist advocacy speech at the Democratic Socialists of America convention designed to reframe Venezuelan suffering as the inevitable cost of fighting American imperialism. But even this sympathetic audience couldn't overcome the damage from Kennedy's exposure of humanitarian reality. When AOC proclaimed that revolutionary change requires accepting temporary hardships in the struggle against capitalist oppression, a Venezuelan refugee in the audience stood up with a Kennedy-style question: "Congresswoman, how is my daughter's death from lack of insulin a temporary hardship rather than a permanent tragedy caused by the socialist system you're advocating?" The question, delivered with heartbreaking precision by someone who had lived through Venezuelan socialism, left AOC visibly shaken. Her response about complex revolutionary processes rang hollow when confronted with actual human loss caused by the policies she promoted. Kennedy's influence extended beyond American politics into global understanding of socialist accountability. Venezuelan opposition groups began using Kennedy's documentation techniques in their own international advocacy, showing how systematic presentation of humanitarian data could effectively challenge socialist propaganda. International development organizations responded to Kennedy's approach by creating new evaluation criteria for political systems that emphasized human welfare outcomes rather than ideological classifications. The World Bank announced new country assessment protocols that would prioritize refugee flows, malnutrition rates, and healthcare collapse as indicators of governmental failure. As AOC's socialist credibility collapsed completely, Kennedy began receiving recognition from unexpected global sources. International human rights organizations, refugee advocacy groups, and Venezuelan diaspora communities acknowledged that his Georgetown performance had accomplished more for Venezuelan awareness than decades of traditional diplomatic efforts. Senator Kennedy forced Americans to see Venezuelan suffering that their own politicians had been hiding behind socialist theory, noted Javier El Hage of the Human Rights Foundation. His approach offers a template for challenging any ideology with humanitarian facts. Kennedy's method had achieved something remarkable in global political discourse. He had created international recognition that political systems required human accountability rather than ideological immunity from criticism. His technique, comprehensive humanitarian documentation, systematic presentation of refugee data, respectful but devastating exposure of human costs, had become a new standard for challenging political theories with human reality. International journalism schools began incorporating Kennedy's Georgetown methodology into their curricula, teaching students that effective political coverage required examining actual human outcomes rather than accepting ideological narratives about governmental success. The European Parliament invited Kennedy to testify about American understanding of Venezuelan conditions, recognizing that his approach provided more reliable assessment of socialist governance than traditional diplomatic channels that often ignored humanitarian consequences in favor of political considerations. The quiet revolution in global socialist accountability was complete. AOC's strategy of romantic socialist advocacy lay in ruins, destroyed by the documented suffering of 7 million Venezuelan refugees and Kennedy's systematic presentation of humanitarian disaster. Kennedy had not just won a political debate, he had transformed international discourse about socialism, creating new standards of human accountability that would influence global political evaluation for generations. As Kennedy returned to his constituent work in Louisiana, reviewing international trade impacts and refugee resettlement programs with his characteristic attention to human outcomes, his global legacy was secure. He had proven that effective political evaluation required honest assessment of human suffering rather than ideological theory, documented humanitarian results rather than political promises, and moral accountability that transcended partisan boundaries to acknowledge the fundamental truth that political systems exist to serve human welfare, not to advance abstract theories that ignore the basic dignity and survival needs of actual people.